What if the wars you see in the Middle East are not just regional conflicts, but the opening chapter of a global power shift that could redefine who controls the world in the 21st century? Because on October 7th, 2023, when Hamas launched a surprise attack on Israel, it was not just another escalation in a long conflict, but an event that shocked political observers and exposed how fragile the existing global order really is, showing how even a non-state actor can trigger consequences that force superpowers to react and rethink their strategies. And since then, the crisis stretching from Gaza to southern Lebanon has not only intensified regional instability, but also pulled global powers into a dangerous geopolitical competition, where economy, security, and diplomacy are all being tested at the same time, turning the Middle East once again into the chessboard where the future world order may be decided. Because historically, this region has never been just about borders or religion, but about influence, resources, identity, and global strategy. And today, that same pattern continues, as the United States attempts to maintain the status quo of a unipolar world where it remains the dominant power, while China and Russia increasingly challenge that dominance by promoting a multipolar system where several powers share influence instead of one hegemon controlling global affairs. And this is why the Middle East crisis matters far beyond the region itself, because it has become one of the main arenas where this transition from American dominance toward shared global power is playing out in real time. But to understand why this matters, we must first understand why the Middle East remains so unstable, despite decades of diplomacy and intervention. Because the roots of instability go deep into unresolved historical conflicts, sectarian divisions, proxy wars, foreign interventions, and socio-economic inequalities that have created a complex web of tensions with no simple solution. And these tensions are further intensified by the involvement of both regional powers like Iran, Turkey, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, and non-state actors like Hamas, Hezbollah, and Kurdish movements who all influence the balance of power in different ways, proving that modern conflicts are no longer controlled only by governments, but also by armed movements and political networks that shape events on the ground. And among the many crises, two stand out as especially important, because they have remained unresolved for decades and continue to destabilize the entire region: the Palestinian conflict and the Kurdish question. Because the Palestinian issue remains one of the longest-running geopolitical disputes, involving territorial claims, refugee rights, and security fears, with Palestinians demanding recognition and statehood, while Israel prioritizes security and demographic concerns. And repeated diplomatic efforts, including the Oslo peace process, have failed to resolve the core disagreements, eroding trust and leaving millions caught between occupation, displacement, and cycles of violence. And similarly, the Kurdish issue represents another long unresolved question involving a large ethnic population spread across Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran, who have historically sought autonomy or recognition, making them a key factor in regional geopolitics, as global powers sometimes view Kurdish groups as potential strategic allies, while regional states often view them as security threats, turning their struggle into both a humanitarian issue and a geopolitical bargaining chip. And when we zoom out, we begin to see that these unresolved conflicts are not isolated problems, but pressure points that global powers must navigate carefully. because their involvement often reflects their broader strategic goals. For example, the United States has historically maintained deep involvement in the region to protect energy routes, fight terrorism, and support allies, while also attempting to broker peace between Israel and Palestine. Yet some interventions, such as the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, have instead increased instability and anti-Western sentiment, raising questions about the effectiveness of military solutions. While Russia has taken a different approach by using opportunities created by conflict, especially in Syria, to rebuild its influence through military presence, alliances, and diplomacy, effectively positioning itself again as a major Middle Eastern power after decades of reduced presence following the collapse of the Soviet Union. And at the same time, China has pursued a largely economic strategy focused on trade, infrastructure, and energy partnerships through projects like the Belt and Road Initiative, avoiding direct military entanglement while steadily increasing its economic footprint and diplomatic influence across the region. And together, these strategies reveal a critical pattern, because the competition is not only military but also economic and diplomatic. With China building connectivity, Russia strengthening strategic partnerships, and the United States trying to maintain alliances while reconsidering its long-term military commitments. And this three-dimensional competition across economy, security, and diplomacy is exactly what makes the current Middle East crisis different from earlier conflicts, because it reflects a larger struggle about how the future international system will function. And this is where organizations like BRICS become important, because they represent attempts by emerging powers to create alternative structures of cooperation that could reduce dependence on Western-dominated systems, signaling a potential redistribution of influence toward the so-called Global South, while Western alliances attempt to maintain their leadership position. And meanwhile, regional rivalries, such as the strategic competition between Iran and Saudi Arabia, continue to fuel proxy conflicts across countries like Yemen, Syria, and Lebanon, demonstrating how local rivalries often intersect with global competition, making every conflict part of a much larger geopolitical puzzle. And as these layers of competition grow more complex, the United States faces a difficult balancing act, because it must both reassure its allies and respond to the growing presence of China and Russia, sometimes reconsidering troop deployments and searching for reliable regional partners, while also managing humanitarian concerns and political criticism related to ongoing conflicts. And yet, despite all this competition, one uncomfortable truth remains: that no single power can fully control the outcome anymore, which is exactly why analysts increasingly describe the world as moving toward multipolarity, a system where influence is divided and negotiated rather than dictated. And this transition may lead either to greater balance or greater instability, depending on how cooperation and rivalry evolve in the coming years. Because multipolar systems historically can either encourage diplomacy through mutual dependence or increase risk through competition and mistrust. And this uncertainty is what makes the Middle East both dangerous and strategically important, because it may serve as the testing ground for whether global powers can manage competition without triggering larger wars. And ultimately, what this crisis reveals is not just the tragedy of regional conflict, but the reality that the international system itself is changing, with new actors rising, alliances shifting, and old assumptions being challenged. And perhaps the most important lesson is that peace in the Middle East cannot be achieved through military dominance alone, but requires inclusive governance, diplomacy, economic development, and recognition of the legitimate aspirations of diverse communities. Because without addressing the root causes of conflict, any temporary ceasefire will only delay the next crisis. And as the balance of power continues to shift, the question is no longer whether the global order is changing, but how peacefully that change can happen. Because whether the future becomes cooperative or confrontational may depend largely on how the world navigates the crises unfolding today in the Middle East. A region that once again stands at the crossroads of history, where local conflicts and global ambitions intersect to shape the next chapter of world politics. Thank you for watching Mind Expedition, where we explore the forces shaping our world. If you enjoyed this deep dive, consider subscribing to join the journey into geopolitics, history, and the unknown.